And now, of course, I want to say thank you to our featured speaker today. Dr. Shawn Behrenfeld is here with me now. And speaking of people that do a lot for the museum, this gentleman is the absolute epitome of that. He's been kind enough to share his amazing collection with us. And not only that, if I twisted his arm a little bit, he agreed to do a speaking presentation as well. So I do appreciate it. Let me tell you just a little bit about him. He was raised on a farm in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. He graduated from Washington State University. He got his degree in zoology, and then in 2001, he got his doctorate in veterinary medicine. He practiced veterinary surgery in Southern California since 2001, started Humanimal Incorporated in 2010. Took a little break in 2005, and he went to the Northwest School for Wooden Boats, building and living on a 200 square foot cabin off the grid. So this is one of these kind of people that just makes you want to strangle him. You know, he can just sort of do everything. That's really cool. Training in traditional blacksmithing and MIG welding from 2016. He started collecting and restoring historical military vehicles and artifacts in 2015. As you can see, I think it's become an addiction for him. He's currently building La Maria, which is the namesake named after his mother. It's a 21-foot wooden gig rig sailboat. Again, just cool stuff. He's also purchased 140 acres in Washington State where he plans to build an educational center to encourage these sorts of traditional trades, and I encourage him in that. That's an amazing thing, and it's something that I think he'll tell you more about, but these are skills that shouldn't be lost, but increasingly are. And if that's not enough, he also plays Irish folk music. I mean, dang. Won't you please welcome our featured speaker today, Dr. Shawn Behrenfeld.
All right, before I get started here, just a couple notes. If you see anything with guns on it, they're all deactivated, so don't worry. The machine guns have no barrels. The receivers are fake dummies, so nothing's going to go bang today. You know, I always like to start public speaking to get my jitters out by talking a little bit about humility, which is something that keeps rearing its ugly head on me every time I talk. Last year I gave this talk, and my big plan was to come riding in gallantly on the Kettenkrad, and as it was out there revving and we were waiting the doors open, it just died. So then we had this 3,000-pound hunk of steel and me out in the sun trying to get me in here. This year, instead of doing that, we decided to take a break from the pomp and just have me show up. And I haven't put on my slacks for a year, and after being in COVID, I realized after those extra 5 to 10 pounds, there's a little humility to be had here. I couldn't get my button tied, so I'm not going to be tucked in today. A quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. I tend to be very long-winded on this topic simply because I'm fascinated with World War II, my own German heritage, and I'll talk about how I kind of got into this, because 6 years ago, I didn't own anything from World War II. I had no knowledge on mechanics. I had no experience with MIG welding or any real knowledge about World War II other than grandpas of best friends and stuff telling me their stories. This is kind of a dark topic, I've found. I've been in it for about 5 years, and as you go around the world, this stuff isn't just down the street. You have to go find this stuff. A lot of times on the internet, a lot of times you have to travel to go see it before you just believe somebody and transfer them money, because anybody can just say, well, I've got this very rare piece, you transfer the money and never hear from them again. I've had a couple of experiences in the beginning that taught me that. But in doing so, you meet some very, very interesting people. I've met billionaires who collect this stuff, and I've also met people who wear SS rings who collect this stuff, and there are neo-Nazis in America that collect this stuff. So there's a wide variety of people, and you have to be very, very careful with this topic, especially these days. Things are getting pretty volatile again. So I like that topic, though. I think it's something that we shouldn't put under the carpet. We have to be very careful, and obviously in our own country, things are pretty polarized right now, so I have to be, I have to tread equally on both political sides, because this is a very political topic. It's about Germany in World War II, but a lot of it transmits to what we're seeing today in a lot of ways. We'll talk a little bit about that. The overview today, I'm just going to give a brief history of the mobilization, from World War I to World War II, what happened in Germany. And then we'll go into the collection itself. I'll just kind of show you some of the common features for the day and what was cutting edge, which we look at now, and it's all analog. It's all dials with little tick, 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 and everything is so digital. That, it's like a road down to history to look at this stuff. It's amazing. And it fascinates me. So if I see really energetic about Nazi material, it's only because of my fascination with how simple, but at the time, how complex it was. And honestly, I love analog. I love traditional trades. I love seeing students not on computers. I love seeing them working with their hands, because if we're not careful, everybody's going to have skills on the screen, but nobody's going to be able to have skills for the infrastructure, which is the basis of society, right? We have to know how cables turn cams and do this stuff. It may seem irrelevant right now, but mark my word, I think we're going to see a change. I really do. I heard recently that the U.S. Navy is starting to teach its officers and seamen how to celestial navigate with sextants and reading charts. The reason is because other countries have learned how to damage our computer systems, and if we have an aircraft carrier out at sea that relies entirely on the internet, and somebody hacks into that, that thing is dead in the water. However, you can't shut down a sextant, at least not yet. All right, with that said, we're going to start here. I renamed this one the Mobilization of Germany before, during, and after World War II, simply because I now have a post-war Unimog, and I would love to talk about that. So I have to include that in the talk. Let's see. Only the dead have seen the end of war. You're going to see two quotes from George Santayana today. This is one of them. I like this because it's very true. If you think about World War I, we call that the Great War. It was the war to end all wars at that time. Nobody could conceive a war worse than World War I, the trench warfare. And then came the war. If you look at all the books, it's called The Greatest Generation, and they fought in the war. World War II, a cataclysmic event that involved the entire world. That was 75 years ago, 76 years ago. There are people living today who fought in World War II still. They're dying off fast, unfortunately, but I remember listening to a lot of stories from my best friend Rob's grandpa, who was on the USS Saratoga, and those stories were crazy. I mean, the things that were common in World War II seem so out of this world now, but at that time, and this is for all experience through history, things are normal back then. There's stories of, 7 guys, I don't know how many get in the B-17, but they kind of knew they were going to their death, but because they were a group, they went in anyways, knowing that the chances of coming back. I don't know a whole lot of millennials these days who would get together with 6 other millennials, get into a tin can to their death. It's probably not too common these days for that sort of mindset. There's other bravery today. I mean, it wears different shoes, but back then that was the normal thing to do. So, we have to remember the passage of time and the normalcies that come along with that. The reason I bring up this slide is because we don't know what's up in front of us. It could be bright, sunny shores. What they called the Great War, the war to end all wars, the war, we don't know what's coming up. But Albert Einstein made a prediction and said the next war will be fought with nuclear weapons, probably worse now, because Albert Einstein didn't know what we have now. And the one after that would be fought with sticks and stones. So it'd be really great if Albert Einstein's prediction didn't have to heed actual experience. Maybe we can prevent that sort of thing. So that's more than just one person or one group can control, but that's my hopes anyways. How and why does one start a collection like this? Well, first of all, you have to have a best friend by the name of Rob Young. I've known Rob Young since 2nd grade. We've been best friends ever since. Rob's a master plumber up in Washington, and one day in 2015 or so, we're talking, and he said, man, you got to check out a Unimog. This is the coolest thing. So I get on the internet, and I look up Unimog. It's not this one. And within about 5 days, I found out in Landers, which is just past the Yucca Valley, a Unimog, and I was a proud owner of a Unimog. That's not World War II. That was Cold War. But it got me very deeply involved in mechanics. And I tore that thing down to the frame, rebuilt it, and in the process, kind kind of learned basic engines, basic analog, batteries, electricity, all this different stuff that kind of rudimentary vehicle maintenance comes along with. And it was a great experience, a great restoration. It's up in Washington still. And that led to a motorcycle, and that motorcycle led to 2 more motorcycles, and those 2 motorcycles led to a car, and then I had a Kugelwagen, and then a Kettenkrad, and then I was looking at, biplanar rangefinders and 20mm cannons, and it just kind of whoop like that, and I was traveling all over the world, getting more and more of my collection and meeting more and more people. And I've had some great periods of education in my life. The veterinary school was great. I always tell people the best education I ever had was the trade school, the wooden boat school, and that I was never a good surgeon until I came out as a boat builder, because all the principles of surgery is only about 85 to 100 years old. Boat building is about 2,000-3,000 years old. I mean, the Vikings were building boats a long time ago. So a lot of the principles for what we use modern day for things like surgery go way back to the original trades. So that got me into the whole Nazi topic. And I'm German, and so I wanted to know some family heritage. There wasn't a whole lot talked about in my family about our German heritage, so I started looking more and more into it, led to books and movies, and here we are in Palm Springs Air Museum, my second talk about Nazi Germany. All right, let's start with World War I with Germany. We'll just do a kind of a brief overcap. I know you all kind of know this stuff, but World War I, there was very minimal motorized vehicles. They were basically horses. They had cannons. They had bolt-action rifles. They had the rudimentary beginnings of a lot of the machine guns that we now attribute to World War II were started in World War I. In fact, a lot of times when you see MG-34, like the machine gun mounted on a motorcycle, that MG, machine gun 34, 1934. So if you see things with acronyms or numbers attached to them, a lot of times it refers to the year. The machine gun that's mounted on the Schwimmwagen, which is between the tan and the car, that little boat with wheels, MG-15, that was used in World War I, 1915. During World War II, that machine gun was transposed onto the airplanes for the Luftwaffe, because they were very light and small, and they could still shoot the 8mm round. So MG-15, 1915. Trench warfare, of course, was very just let him go by. Trench warfare was pretty brutal experience for the soldiers. The Spanish flu happened at the same time. Spain was a neutral country, that's why they call it the Spanish flu. There's a lot of history on why they called it the Spanish flu, but it originated from the fighting in the trenches, from what I've read. The Blitzkrieg philosophy. So Blitzkrieg, lightning war, came from World War I. We always think Blitzkrieg, the German Nazi regime, came from World War I. Towards the end, the Germans were trying to figure out how to stop this stalemate between the trenches of the Allies and Axis. And they figured out at night they could have little infantry groups that were very fast on horses, get behind the enemy lines, and then attack them from behind. That began the philosophy of Blitzkrieg, which we'll talk about with World War II. At the end of World War I, the treaty was signed. Remember, Great Depression was, this finished in 1919, I think, 1919, 1918, and the Great Depression was soon to follow. That was 1929, am I correct on that? Okay, so about 10 years, there was the Roaring Twenties coming up. Germany had a different experience. They didn't really have the Roaring Twenties. They had the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles had a lot of things in it, but basically after World War I, the main things that kind of led into World War II were the restrictions, not only economically, that happened from the Great Depression, but also the Treaty of Versailles. They couldn't have an army over 1 million people, and only a very small percentage of them could be officers trained to a very limited capacity. They couldn't have an air force, no Luftwaffe, so basically just airplane clubs and their commercial airlines, Lufthansa, were their modes of training pilots. They couldn't have an air force, and also no submarines and no tanks. So they had a lot of constrictions. There were also financial reparations going on, and the Great Depression hits, which of course affected the whole world. And what ultimately happened is the Versailles Treaty, combined with the Great Depression, created such an economic turmoil in the country of Germany that it was almost inevitable that Adolf Hitler would come crawling out of this treaty. That's what this cartoon's about. The people of Germany were in dire straits. Some of them were eating their shoes and their pets just to stay alive. So it was really, really bad. And they were looking for a savior. And at first it seemed like they had one. They started to mobilize way before World War II. They used their tractor facilities to build tanks. They used industry for agriculture, big agriculture buildings, to act as airplane hangars and start to develop engines and planes for the Luftwaffe. It's a picture of that. And industry started happening. People were put back to work. Here's a fellow working on a K-98 rifle, one of the most famous rifles ever built. And people were happy because they were back at work and they were starting to earn money, and industry was developing in Germany again. You'll recognize these famous logos from cars and whatnot that we see every day. Hugo Boss is a famous men's clothing line. But they're all tied to Nazi Germany. Mercedes-Benz had this on the left is a propaganda poster with the Luftwaffe flying overhead at Mercedes L3000 right there. The DKW on top, you'll recognize the four rings of Audi. That's DKW, Porsche, Wanderer, and Audi. And those four companies were failing, and then when Hitler came along, they were bound into the one company, Audi, and that's what the four rings represent. The Hugo Boss collection, the original Boss senior fellow, I forget his first name, was a designer of Nazi uniforms. And he also came up with a very unique color. You'll see most of the collection is this dark green-gray color. That's called Dunkelgrau. And Adolf Hitler wanted a color that was completely invisible in the shade. Black is not invisible in shade. You can see black in the shade. And the original textile owner, Mr. Boss, and a few others came up with this color Dunkelgrau. And if any of these vehicles parks in the shade, it's invisible. It's incredible. it's incredible how they just kind of disappear. And then let's see what else. BMW. BMW actually was a company that made airplane engines originally for World War I. The Red Baron and other famous German pilots had BMW engines in their planes. The roundel with the blue and white circle in it on the cars you see today, everybody thinks that's the spinning propeller. That's why I put this up there. And that's a misnomer. That's from a movie, I think in the 90s, called Finding Forrester, where he said, well, that's a spinning airplane propeller. It's actually not. It's the Bavarian flag in a roundel. It just was mistaken in that movie. So you'll recognize those. Porsche, by the way, Ferdinand Porsche was the original designer of Volkswagen, the people's car. So we'll talk a little bit about that. There's a thousand Nazi generals and personalities through the World War II that I could possibly bring up. I like to bring up von Siegt and also Guderian. So the first one, Hans von Siegt, he's the one with the monocle there. He was a soldier and general from World War I. He played a part in between the two wars as an overseer of the army. And then he retired, and then he was brought back during World War II. His importance here is that he was very instrumental in reorganizing and developing the German army around the Treaty of Versailles, how to kind of find the fine points, kind of like lawyers do today to get things through. He found the fine points on how to develop an army under the guise of it's just being agriculturally built, or it's just us training people in airplane clubs and stuff like that. Heinz Guderian on the right there, he's up there because he was an advocate of the Blitzkrieg, and again, lightning war. And a lot of the early war philosophy for Germany, remember they were on the offense at that time, from 1939 through 1941, 42, they were basically offensive and expanding, not only west but also east into Russia. And the Blitzkrieg philosophy of warfare was a new one, and it was very effective. So basically they would have infantry divisions on wheels, motorcycles, supported with the air strikes, and then the tank division, the panzer divisions, would follow through. The front line of the Blitzkrieg was always these motorcycle units, and I have a couple of motorcycles here. Those are both early war, 1940 and 1941 BMWs. You'll notice that they're lower to the ground, and they are civilian motorcycles that were conscripted to the war effort until later in the war, 1942, 43, 44, they were building BMWs and zoomed ups that were higher up and more capable for the war. But at the beginning, all the resources just grab bicycles, grab motorcycles, paint them Dunkelgrau, and go. And so these early war bikes were designed around the Blitzkrieg philosophy. One person riding, one on the back, which was the rifleman, and then one guy on the sidecar. When they got to their destination, parked the motorcycle under a tree, got into a foxhole. The motorcycle guy jumps off, he's feeding the bullets into the machine gunner, and then the guy with the rifle is the one that's sniping and protecting them. But it was a very effective way of attacking towns before they had a chance to really respond. So we'll jump into the collection here for a bit, and we'll go over some other stuff afterwards. So the first one, nothing motorized, it's a bicycle. So this is a common bicycle that you would have seen during the 20s and 30s. I've got a couple of extras on there, it's very dusty right now, but you'll see almost every bicycle from that era. If you watch any of the movies, no matter where it's from, America, Europe, all the bicycles were the same. Nowadays, our bicycles are just like a crazy collection of bananas. They all look different. But almost all the bicycles were the same. And so, as Germany expanded, it took over town after town, they would just find these bicycles and take them. And they would paint them, and off they went as now German bicycles. We always think of the German army as this Panzer division, this really powerful tanks and half-tracks and all these things. That only accounted for about 10 to 15% of the German army. The other 85% were on foot, on horses, and on bicycles. And we just don't think of that because it's not pushed in the movies, but a lot of them were on bicycles. The bicycles are rather interesting. You'll see on that particular one that there's a lot of parts that are added to it. You can see in this picture as well. The box in the middle is a machine gun canister box. And so if you pop the lid, there's a machine gun canister which holds, I think, 150 rounds. And they also would use that box to put the potato masher hand grenades. You can line 3 of those inside that box. They would also put the hand grenades and extra bullet cans on the back rack. There are different varieties of this bicycle that would mount machine guns. You'll see in this picture an SS patrolman with a machine gun mounted over the top bar. They carried them everywhere. These bikes are not light. Nowadays we have bikes that are 10, 15 pounds. That thing is ridiculously heavy. It's like 45 pounds or something like that. It's crazy. And then you put on all the gear, all the wool, nothing was Lycra or anything back then. It was all wool, heavy wool, and leather, and the canisters, the gas masks, the bullets, everything. It's just so heavy. I'm sure these bikes would easily weigh 80 plus pounds when they're carrying them over rocks and streams. I like this picture because it kind of shows a bike unused. That either means that they just stole this one and they're moving on to their next place, or maybe they just lost a brother in battle, I don't know. But they don't want to let go of the bike because the bikes were so valuable. It's much better than walking. All right, the first vehicle is the Opel Cadet. And this is just an officer's car. It's over there, kind of third from the left. I like the Cadet. It's a very interesting vehicle, but I like it particularly because it showcases a couple of very unique features that these cars and trucks almost all have in common. So we'll just kind of look at this real quick. First of all, the color. It's Dunkelgrau, and this car was 1939. Early war, Dunkelgrau is the color. Everything was Dunkelgrau. It wasn't until 1942 that Adolf Hitler recognized that they were going to be on the retreat, so they started painting things Hellgelb, which is dark yellow. And then towards the end of the war, on the real retreat, 1944, 1945, everything bigger than a bicycle was basically camouflaged. The Kettenkraft's an example of that, 1944. The features on this car that I would like to show you, very first thing is on the left fender. It's kind of hard to see, but if you can't see, you can walk around and look at these. A lot of these vehicles have them, so I'll point them out on each one. Is a blackout light. And that little kind of German helmet-looking thing is basically a lot of the time that the German military was mobilizing during World War II was at night. because there were not a lot of technologies to see things moving at night back then like we have now. You know, we have all this crazy radar and stuff now, and that wasn't as commonplace back then. So they would just drive at night. But your headlights make you a sitting duck for, you know, a red tail coming down and strafe you with bullets. So what they would do is they'd drive in formation. And that required to be able to see, of course, if all your headlights are off. So the black light, or no-tech light, it's called no-tech light, would shine a very thin, flat beam right in front of the vehicle so that you wouldn't drive off the road, but you couldn't see a whole lot else. What you could see, however, were the taillights in front of the guy, or in front of you. And the taillights weren't taillights either, because again, easy to see. And so the no-tech taillights is this little flap that comes over the taillights, and it gives you 4 lights. When you're too far away, it's 4 lights. When you get close enough, it's 2 lights. And if you get too close, it turns into 4 lights again, 4 little green lights. And that's how they followed each other. It's specifically, when your eyes would see 2 lights, you knew you were between 10 and 20 meters away from the car in front of you, and they all followed each other just looking at those 4 lights. Another feature on the Opel that I'd like to show is those little flags on either side of the front windshield. That's how they signaled. They didn't have the flashy signals, and so they'd have literally just a fan that would open, and that would indicate to the guy following you, you're going right or left, which is kind of fun. Let's see. You know, speaking of some of the limitations that we look at now that they had back then, they didn't have a whole lot of plastic. In fact, plastic kind of was a new thing right at like D-Day. Some of the people who stormed the shore at D-Day had plastic sheaths over their rifles to keep the sand out of the rifles. But almost all of the materials in Germany, just leather and metal and wood. We're kind of going out there. Leather, metal, wood, not a lot of plastic. There was a precursor to plastic called Bakelite. And Bakelite, you'll remember from those old phones from the 20s that you'd hold up to here, that's an example of Bakelite. So it's kind of a rudimentary precursor to plastic. And so on some of the machine guns, or even on pistols and stuff from World War II, you'll see Bakelite handles instead of plastic. They also had no internet, right? There was no internet, there were no cell phones. A lot of things we just assume for today didn't exist back then. So communication was by very rudimentary radio, analog systems, and navigation, charts, maps, compasses. And it's fun to go back and look at these old charts because, man, they had to figure it all out. I maintain that the brightest minds in the world existed from 1800 to about 1930 because we have very bright people now, but we all assume the answer on the computer or the calculator is correct. They actually had to do long division to figure it out first before they could go on to the next invention. So I really like that they had to go from scratch for everything that they made with basic skills of mathematics and physics and stuff. It's pretty neat. I think that kind of covers the Opel. Opel was built by Ford, and the Ford factories in Germany converted over to building these Opel cars. And the Opel Blitz is a famous truck from World War II movies you'll see. It's basically the cousin to the Mercedes L3000. There's just some photos of German officers with these cadets. You'll notice that a lot of the headlights have little shrouds over them. Again, that's just black lighting. So the British did that, the Americans did that too. Basically just trying to cut down as much headlight or any light or indications that you're on the road, because strafing with war planes was a very common thing in World War II, so you wanted to be kind of inconspicuous. Okay, the Mercedes L3000S, probably, every time I say something's my very favorite part of the collection, I move on to the next one that's my very favorite, but man, I love this thing. This Mercedes truck is 1941. It oozes early World War II Germany. It has the blackout lights, no-tech light on the front. It has these covers. You'll see on some vehicles little whiskers with white balls on them. These are basically the lateral extent of the vehicle. That's where they put these whiskers. And so if you've been to Europe, which many of you probably have, you notice that a lot of their streets and alleyways are very narrow compared to American streets. And so these would just basically make a brrrr sound on the walls as you drive by, to correct, to not hit the wall. That's basically what that is. The chrome star is a fake. I can't get it off because you have to disassemble the radiator to get that off, but that's plastic. They did have a metal star, but these days finding a Mercedes metal star of that size is nearly impossible. And they would probably want about $4,000 for that silly star, so I'm going to just go with the plastic one for now. It is a diesel. It's a 4-cylinder diesel, but it's a pretty big engine, and it's geared very, very low for towing things like artillery, troops, and cargo, including a lot of ammunition, which is very heavy. You'll see the little flags here for signaling right and left. And let's see, this is my favorite feature of this truck. This bed is called a Myler-Kipper tilt bed. It's on a piston, it tilts in 3 different directions. The reason I like it is because the Myler-Kipper company goes back to 1860. It was actually a horse-drawn carriage company that they used for timber and all these other things. And during the war, Germany relied on itself, and so they used, implements used from 100 years before to augment their war machines. And it's kind of interesting to see that. But it's a very old German company, the Myler-Kipper bed. Again, it was used on carts to move hay and logs and stuff back in the 1800s. Let's see. I think that's pretty much it on the Mercedes. On the other side of the Mercedes is a Jeep. That's not a World War II Jeep, that's a Korean War Jeep. The only reason I know that, the M38, is because I'm building one right now in my shop. And, the Jeep is a very famous vehicle for America. There's quite a history to the Jeep. And the M38 can be discerned from the World War II MB by 2 main features. The front headlights are bulbed out instead of recessed in, and the windshield is a solid single pane of window instead of split. World War II MB had a split windshield. The reason I bring up the Jeep is not because it's part of the German talk, but kind of, because the Jeep has been often compared to the Volkswagen Kugelwagen, which is a 2-wheel drive vehicle. The Jeep, very famous, can go anywhere, do anything type of vehicle. It had the Go Devil 4-cylinder engine, 4-wheel drive, short wheelbase. It could crawl over just about anything. It's 3-speed, and the first gear is very, very low, so you can just churn over everything. So can the Kugelwagen, and I think that's our next vehicle here. If you ever have an interest, you can look up the Kugelwagen versus the Jeep. And it's very interesting. They put these 2 vehicles head-to-head on some of these rally tracks, and the Kugelwagen keeps right up to the Jeep and sometimes actually outperforms the Jeep, which is amazing because it's just a rear-wheel drive vehicle. It's not 4-wheel drive. But here's a couple features about it. First of all, Kugelwagen, bucket seat car. It was one of the first designs that had bucket seats instead of bench seats. Why did they do that? Well, they found in early pre-war that people were taking turns really fast on a bench seat. Everybody would go whoop right off the seat. So they designed the bucket seat so that you had bars to hold on to taking tight turns. The Kugelwagen is often mistaken for the Volkswagen Thing. The Volkswagen Thing is a 1970s version of the Kugelwagen for civilians. The Kugelwagen is actually the World War II military vehicle. I love Kugelwagens. They're very interesting. They're quite rare. There's only maybe 200,000 of these in the world at this point, true World War II Kugelwagens. You'll see a couple more common things here, the no-tech light in the front, the hood over the headlights. This one mounted a lot of external implements simply because they wanted the room inside the car to move around and not have everything bunched up. There's a couple of rifle holders in the middle of the vehicle, external shovel, gas cans and everything were all mounted externally. The reason this is such a capable vehicle is because of a couple things. Number one, the engine's right over the wheels, putting the weight of the vehicle, the actual weight of the vehicle, right over the wheels, giving it grip. They had differentials that were being designed, which gave positive traction in these vehicles. But 2 main features make this one of the best early examples of overland vehicles. Number one, it's really light. It's about 1,100 pounds, 1,200 pounds. To give you a reference, the war bikes that were being built at that time, the big, heavy BMWs and Zundaps, were about 1,200 pounds. So this car actually weighs about the same, if not a little lighter than one of the big motorcycles. 2 to 3 people can easily push this thing over a log. It's very light. Second feature, it doesn't have the drivetrain underneath the vehicle. Everything's within a tube on a pan. So basically the bottom of the vehicle is essentially flat. So it's really great to sled it over mud, over snow, over logs. You can get 2 to 3 guys who just literally push it over things. And there's pictures of people just pushing it upstairs and stuff. It's light and it's flat. One of the other great features about the Kugelwagen is it was very inexpensive to build, which, especially as the war progressed and materials got less and less, and also money, they wanted to build things that were efficient. And so the motorcycles that were being built were quite complex for the time. You could build one Kugelwagen for the amount of materials and costs for 3 motorcycles at the time. So here's a few photos. This is an African photo. The Kugelwagen saw service in all the fronts that Germany went, from Western Front to Russian Eastern Front, Northern Africa. Here's a photo from Northern Africa. Notice the tires are big balloon tires. That's for the sand. Here's one. You'll see that this one's painted camouflage, meaning that it's probably a photo from 1944 or later. I think that's the same group. Here's externally mounted gas cans. Everything was mounted externally. You see some planks there for putting underneath the tires when they get stuck in the mud. This was probably from the Eastern Front, Russia. The next one's the Volkswagen Schwimmwagen, swim car. Literally, it's a boat with wheels, and very unique. There's about 50 or so, give or take, Schwimmwagens that are actually from the war left in the world intact. There's a fellow in Clio, Michigan, Dave Crompton, who is known around the world for his restorations. This was a Dave Crompton restoration. This is the only vehicle on my collection that's not painted correct for the year. This is a 1943. It should be either tan or camouflage, but the previous owner, who lived in Canada, he absolutely wanted a Ducal Gras Schwimmwagen. So Dave painted it, thanks to his cries about it, he painted it Ducal Gras, which I think it looks great. It had an external, two different external mounts for machine guns, one facing back, one facing forward. There's a propeller on the back of this car, and perhaps after the talk, if you're interested, we can just move the rope so you can walk behind some of these vehicles and see. The propeller, it runs directly off the drive, and the person in the back seat would basically turn around, take a wand, and just drop it onto the drivetrain when the car went into the water. First gear is 4-wheel drive. Every other gear is 2-wheel drive off the back of the drivetrain. And again, like the Kugelwagen, the engine's in the back, right over the back drivetrain wheels. Got some interesting photos of the Schwimmwagen. It's kind of a dark photo. But that one's very muddy. It makes me want to believe that it's also a camouflaged Schwimmwagen, so it makes me believe it's probably Eastern Front 1943. Camouflage, late war. I like this picture because look at how exposed they are, right? Look at how the militaries are designed now. Everybody's so protected with armor and whatnot. These guys were literally in a little floating frog out there, and machine gun fire coming at them, and the only thing they had protecting them was the glass windshield. Probably wasn't even safety glass. Here's one going into the water. The paddle on the side, which is mounted, is your reverse, and that's a very, very technologically advanced reverse. Going forward, you might wonder how do you steer this thing? You got a propeller going in first gear that's pushing you along. You just turn the front wheels; they act as the rudder. Not terribly nimble. Here's an adaptation of a Schwimmwagen for snow. It wasn't used a whole lot. I think that there probably was a flaw in the design, but there are several pictures of that. Some driving by and salute. All right, the Kettenkrad. Technically the rarest motorcycle on the planet. There's about 45 original World War II Kettenkrads left on let's see, service, functioning ones. There's some extra ones in museums that don't work, but this is one of the rare ones. Camouflaged, it's 1944, and a feature on this particular Kettenkrad is it has a headlight, and there's some controversy among the collectors about why this particular one has a headlight. There's only a couple of options. Kettenkrad was built in different batches, and the batch before the last one had a headlight, but the final batch had no headlight. They were running out of materials. They just want to pound these things out, so headlights seemed kind of irrelevant for this machine's use. So a lot of the 1944s don't have a headlight. This one does, meaning it was either a very, very late one from the previous batch that was just pushed out at the wrong time, or somebody after the war just welded it on, which is probably the most likely. Most likely. It has a light cover, No tech light on this one. It wasn't really used for road travel. It was sometimes, but basically the function of the Kettenkrad, it's a very unique, odd-looking thing. It's kind of an awkward one to drive, but basically think of it as a tugboat for the land. So it would pull the jet planes that Germany was developing at the end of the war to save jet fuel. They would just pull it into position before it took off with a Kettenkrad. It would pull big vehicles out of mud in the eastern front. It would pull ammunition. It would lay cables. You know, it would basically kind of like a mule. But it's very capable, and it's almost unstoppable. It's 1 meter wide and about 3,000 pounds of steel, but it's got the exact same engine as the Opel car, a little 4-cylinder, and it's just on tracks. It'll climb just basically anything. Here's a couple pictures of a Kettenkrad. Trailer behind it was specifically built for it for the mud and the swamps in the eastern front in Russia. Because they were going through a lot of mud and swamp, they wanted a trailer that could carry ammunition but not sink, and so they made a watertight trailer for this vehicle. Here's one in the snow, and the big spool on the back is just laying cable. There's another cable drawing one. Here's a good picture of that little watertight trailer being pulled. All right, and with the motorcycles, so out of the 8 or 9 German motorcycles that I have, kind of ran out of time getting everything here today, so I've got 2 that are early war BMWs. The motorcycle is very interesting, part of the German armament. It was used massively. I mean, there were so many motorcycles built for this war. Again, sitting ducks. They were used for many different purposes. One of the big ones is just move batch papers from one camp to the next. And then, of course, in the early war, blitzkrieg technique of attacking towns, and the motorcycles were a good answer for that. At the beginning of the war, the BMWs, the Zundaps, the DKWs were civilian bikes. They just painted them Dunkelgrad went. They just took bikes. At the end of the war, by about 1942, Zundap won over the design contract to make the war bike. They were hired. Both wheels in the rear could be locked, so you'd have a 2-wheel drive motorcycle. Very, very capable, very, very heavily built. And BMW, which the R75 people are familiar with, actually was just handed over Zundap's plans by Adolf Hitler. He just said, I just want both companies. And so that created a lot of bad blood between the 2 companies. BMW, of course, we all know, went on to make a lot of cars and motorcycles after the war. Zundap, unfortunately, became a lawnmower company owned by a Chinese company, and then it just kind of dissolved. But the old Zundaps are amazing bikes. One of the things I love about old German war bikes is how simple they are. I'm not really a mechanic, but even when I break down on the road, which is about every 4 miles, you can pretty much figure out how to fix yourself and get on the road again. They're very simple, and they draw a lot of attention. These old war bikes, this one's if I look at that closely, that's a BMW. I can tell by the front forks on that one. They're carrying, about 1,000 pounds worth of men, plus probably another 200-300 pounds worth of gear. They can really pull. I've pulled this truck into my shop with one of the motorcycles. Geared very low, very powerful engine, 750. There's a townswoman feeding a German blitzkrieg group. You can see the mounted MG34 on the sidecar there. There's a fellow, probably eastern fronts in the snow. Looks pretty miserable. I'm not sure what that picture is. You can see a Tiger tank on the left and a horse in the background on the right. These guys look like they've been on the road for quite a while, suffering. It was a rough war for a lot of people. I mean, obviously, any war is rough, but this one, particularly on the Eastern Front, some of the books I've read and some of the stories, man, there was suffering going on back then. And they just went forward. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on this topic, but I know speed, methamphetamine, was a drug that was pushed out pretty heavily to the troops, and they could fight fiercely with no food for days, and they just used drugs, and they just drugged their soldiers. There's a lot of different stories and books about that, if you're interested in reading on it. This guy's having a better day. The Propst is behind him. That was a very famous German artillery pulling vehicle. This is an old Zundap. That's a KS 750. That's the equivalent of the R75. This is the bike that had the original patent. And then Hitler said, BMW, you can take that patent and just go with it. And just a poster. What's interesting about the poster picture here is you have to remember that's what they had. They had posters, they had radio, and they had newspapers, and they had gatherings. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have those things. And that's going to be part of what I talk about here at the end. A couple last little bits on the collection here, the trailers. We talked about the trailer that the Kettenkrad pulls. That's a watertight trailer specifically for that vehicle. The one on the right in this picture here is called an IF8 trailer. I didn't bring any, actually there's one behind the tan Kubelwagen that's being pulled. The IF8 trailer was pre-World War II. It was a horse and man cart that was used for chopping wood and taking it to your house and stuff, and they just put an attachment to it, put it behind vehicles, and all of a sudden it was part of the World War II German Army. Make do with what you got. These are the two recent additions to my collection, the Flak 38 cannons. You wouldn't believe what it takes these days to get a 20mm cannon into the United States of America. It is not fun, and I learned it the hard way. I will never buy anything artillery or gun related across seas again. These are two examples, one on that end, one right here, of the most mass-produced anti-aircraft weapon in history. These were mounted on boats on the back of trucks, such as the Mercedes L3000. They were pulled behind cars. Even a Kubelwagen with the appropriate undertrain tow hitch could pull one of these things. They weigh about 1,200 pounds, and they're on a carriage. That's the wheels and the frame holding it. But basically, they would be plopped down with a team of 3, and they're on a tripod, and they just sit there on the ground. And they have both elevation and traverse, and they can really move those things. A guy who's trained to do that with these 2 wheels can move that thing like a guy who's doing a backhoe. I mean, it's just amazing how articulate you can be with this. It shot canisters holding 20 rounds apiece. The canisters would be fired at a very fast rate. And if you ever want to see these in movies, the movie Red Tails has a great scene of when the Red Tail squadron attacks a German airfield. There's about 4 of them shooting at them. Great scene of them. Band of Brothers, when they first land on D-Day, Sergeant Winters and the guy he was with were going one direction, and all of a sudden a Flak-de-Beer, a 4-barreled flak cannon, was in the woods, and they turned around. That's a great example of the 4-barreled one. And so getting them into America, the reason it was so hard is you can't have it. So what you have to do is you have to break down the receiver. And by breakdown, I mean annihilate. They had this thing cut, each of the receivers, which basically the barrel goes into the tube, and the part that's in the circular holster there is the receiver. That's the part that cycles the rounds. And they had to weld cut, or was that laser cut? There's a word for it. They had to cut it through metal, and it just annihilates the whole thing. And I had to search high and low in Southern California for a welder down here who could reconstruct them, and he did such a beautiful job. And they look basically like from just like they did when they were over in Europe. It took about 1.5 years to get these 2 here. Oh, let me go back. It's kind of heavy, and I don't think it moves too well, but on the left of that screen you'll see an 88, also a very famous German anti-aircraft, and it was used for anti-personnel. It was one of the big guns used against the D-Day invasion on the German side, over in Normandy. And outside front you'll see that they have an 88, a real rare piece, one of the only ones in America actually. It's gray out there, it's out front. And that leads us to post-World War II. It comes to my most recent purchase. I have 2 of these. One's in bad shape and this one is in great shape. And this is the Mercedes Unimog. This particular model is called a 2010. It has nothing to do with the year. It's just called 2010. It's a Swiss version. The Unimog, so Germany lost the war. And a lot of Germany was destroyed by the war, along with a lot of Europe. To rebuild Germany was a big pill to swallow. And so one of the things that they had to do is they had to make sure that there was a lot of Nazis still in Germany, and the Nazi philosophy was still far and wide among the people. So there was a re-education effort, but also they wanted to rebuild in the German industry, and as you know, they became an ally instead of the enemy. Now Germany is considered an ally to America. How did that happen? Well, America put a lot of money to Germany, and so did a lot of European countries, to rebuild Germany and reconstruct Germany. The Unimog's one small element to that reconstruction. Unimog is Universal Motorrad. That's just what the acronym stands for. Universal Motorized Vehicle. Even though this is a Swiss version that came in 1950 through 52, the original Unimogs were starting to be built and designed around 1948 to rebuild Germany. How does a single truck do that? Well, a lot of the farm and timber industry use these things. The Unimog is designed to be 2 potato rows wide. Not too many cars are designed based on the width of the potato row. It is a PTO front and back, basically think tractor with 4 equal-sized wheels. The 4 equal-sized wheels allow it to go to road speeds. Road speeds back then were about 35 miles an hour. This thing is screaming at 35 miles an hour. It is barely able to do 35 miles an hour. I would never take this thing at 35 miles an hour. It's a total danger. So road speed was from the 4 equal tires, but the tractor enabled them to do things like farm and pull timber and do all these different implemental farm and industry uses. Here's one where he's doing a reaper sower type of implement off the front, PTO, powertrain offtake. So they could run implements both front and back off of this tractor. Here's one pulling a harvesting machine. Here's one timber pulling a lot of trees. They just took the whole cab off this one. So what's the point of the cab for this thing? Nothing. It's basically just a train on the soil. Here's one pulling quite a bit of weight. It's a little 4-cylinder diesel. It's just maybe about this big, the engine's a tiny little thing, but it's geared so low that first gear is almost like a concept. And you're not actually, you just take your foot off the pedal just as they're idling in first gear. Full blast on first gear is slower than a person can walk with hindrance. It's very, very slow. But it'll climb just about anything. We've seen this guy before too, the Kettenkrad. 5,000 Kettenkrads were allowed to be built after the war, not for military purposes, but they saw the value of that vehicle as what it is. It's a tracked vehicle that can pull timber. It's got a tremendous amount of torque, and so they used it for timber, for agriculture. Here's one spraying, probably seed or fertilizer. So they were using that one after the war. This is a great picture. Remember I said at the end of the war they weren't putting headlights on. Well, the headlights on the Kettenkrad during the war were mounted high. This guy just put a headlight on the bottom. Again, this may be an example where somebody just welded it on after the war. But you know, that's what it looked like. If you kind of ignored the headlight, that's what a Kettenkrad looks like without a headlight. So that comes to the final part here. Why is this all important? Why did I get into this? I don't know. I don't know why I got into this. Because of Rob. Half of the things I do in my life are just because Rob says, hey, check this out, and whatnot. But you know, it's good to have a friend like that because it opens doors, and it opens, for me, a 5-year odyssey of learning and reading. Has anybody here ever read Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler? Just a couple of hands, 3 maybe, 3, 4. I had the distinct displeasure of reading Mein Kampf during the pandemic. I had about 2 or 3 months of downtime this year, and aside from putting on 10 pounds so I can't button my own pants, I always was like, you know, I should really read Mein Kampf. So I found an English translation, and it's about 700 plus pages of the exact same sentence over and over and over. That's how I felt about it. It really, you know, he used the term daily bread about 4 times every paragraph. He just kept going. It's a terrible read, but it moved people. This was a time when people were desperate, where they were divided from their surrounding countries, where they were repressed. They were facing severe economic repression, depression, and resources were low for Germany, and they had a low self-esteem because they had just fought World War I and lost it, and Germans are very proud people. I can say that from my own experience. We're very proud and stubborn people, and we're very bright people. We're not dumb. Germans make some of the best cars. They make some of the best instruments. They make, you know, as a surgeon, you want German instruments. You don't want stuff from Pakistan. You want it from Germany. There's a reason for that, right? There's a reason Mercedes-Benz and BMW are what they are, because they're built with a level of integrity and planning for the future. The Jeep, the M38 there was not World War II, but the Jeeps expectation in battle was 3 months. They built it to last 3 months in battle. The Germans built this stuff not only to win the war, but also to last after the war, to control the countries that they built, or that they beat after the war. These things are built, for the time, very, very well. These Volkswagens, you just turn, as long as you got a good battery, you just turn the key and you just fire right up. That's not so true about a lot of the American stuff. You really got to keep working on these things. These are really tightly developed vehicles. Germany was in trouble around 1930s, early 30s. Adolf Hitler is just another person. He's just a human being. A lot of people say he was born evil. I'm not so sure about that. He was born a child. He was born into a family. His father was an anti-Semite, and that's an influence, right? Apple falls not too far from the tree. And so Adolf Hitler became one of the most notorious people on earth, but he didn't start that way. He started as a child, and it's all about environment. The environment people are in, the stresses that they're put under. He was an accomplished artist living in Vienna. He had very strong opinions. He met maybe the wrong people, and you hang around the wrong cats long enough, you become one of those cats, right? So Adolf Hitler, this is a photo. I don't know if this was actually during his internment in prison, but he wrote Mein Kampf while in prison around 1926. And that book, like I say, is kind of a tough read. I didn't get through all 700 pages. I just fell asleep. It was a great way to fall asleep. But it moved people. And he was, without argument in my opinion, one of the most prolific public speakers of all time. We don't want to give him credit for things, but he was an amazing speaker, and he moved people to madness, right? So he was an inspirational person. He gave them direction. He gave them industry. He brought on the Autobahn for Germany, a huge project to bring jobs. They saw him as a visionary. They almost saw him godlike. And the reason I bring this up, and also you'll notice that all of these slides are in black and white, and there's a reason for that. Here he is with Ferdinand Porsche, the originator of the Porsche company, showing him the prototype of the Volkswagen Bug, the people's car. He wanted an affordable car that can mobilize people, get them off the horse and into the modern world. And he wanted all of his people to be able to have at least this car. There's a photo of him with thousands of people watching him stepping into a convertible Volkswagen. But then something went terribly wrong. And I think this is probably the most important thing I can do as a speaker at an air museum with a small collection of German stuff, is to maybe bring this up. I'm not an expert on the topic, but if you just sit and watch this world, things are repeating themselves. We have to be very, very careful about this. We have our own politicians these days. And who's to say who's going to be a leader versus the next Hitler? Nobody really knows. We have all these characters from after World War II until the present day, and any one of them with a mob behind him and finances behind him, or her, could turn into another Adolf Hitler. Maybe not now, maybe in 50 years. But what's important is, again, Albert Einstein's prediction: the next war will be fought with nuclear weapons, the war after that, clubs and stones. We're at that breaking point with society. We can see even a country as strong as the United States becoming almost divided down the middle right now. And we have to be careful about the characters we put our support behind. This is Goebbels, I think is how you pronounce it. The reason I put Goebbels up there, again, there's many Nazis you can put up on a screen, but Goebbels was the administrator of propaganda. And he had an incredibly powerful position, probably the most powerful position in the whole Nazi regime, save for Hitler, is that he spoke to the people, and he did so brilliantly. He did it in the wrong direction. Imagine what Germany could have done if they had put their energy and resources and knowledge and skill towards a good purpose. It could have been amazing. But this is just an example of how the power of speech, the power of propaganda, and what I would say the most important thing, the power of media. Because remember, they accomplished that horrific thing that involved the entire world with newspapers, radio waves, and small collections of people, small being thousands. We now have the internet, we have cell phones, we have hundreds of thousands of people that can collect on a common goal The enemy is no longer the Japanese or the Krauts or the Russians. The enemy could be your next door neighbor. We don't even know. Right? It's so impossible to find a common enemy, and that's why I think it's so convoluted for the young generation. They're becoming so confused. Things seemed to be, and I didn't live back then, but things were very black and white back then, a little bit easier to conceptualize. And nowadays, our young are raised on the computer. They're not raised with slide rules and shoveling dirt and chopping wood. They're raised on computers, and that has me very afraid for the future. But there's, it's not all doom and gloom. Here's a photo of burning the books during the rise of Nazi Germany, about 1939. Salutes. This picture is taken from about a year ago on the streets of America. It's not the only fire that's happened in America or anywhere in the world, but it's a very poignant photo. Here's the riots this year on the streets. The riots on January 6th, different to the rioting spectrum, but riots none the same, nonetheless. You saw the burning of the books, the people saluting. Well, this was 2 years ago in Charlottesville. So, we're not that far. Where are we going as people? We see a collection like this, and we see, we can group it as an evil time in history. But it didn't end then. Evil does persist, and it's our responsibility not to sweep it under the carpet. We have to talk about it. Places like this need to exist because we have to keep teaching and talking about it. If we lose the dialogue, then history repeats itself. And that's my last saying from George Santayana. So those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I think that's a very good place to end, kind of dark, but a very good place to end, especially after the year that we've seen, is that if we just ignore it or go to one side and not listen to each other. I think one thing I've noticed, if anything, is that people just talk over each other anymore. Nobody listens to anybody anymore. The Native Americans used to sit in a circle past the pipe, and everyone had a chance to talk without being interrupted. And how often do you turn on Fox News Network or CNN and people are allowed to talk? They immediately talk over each other. Nothing gets accomplished if you're not listening. You have to listen. We have to teach children to listen and pay attention. And this is where I think the next 10, 20 years of effort needs to go, is our children. And getting to appreciate and have values. And this is a great example of where we should be using analog instead of digital. Thank you very much for coming. It's the warm one.